April 15, 1945. The island of Okinawa trembled under the weight of the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific Theater. More than 180,000 troops had landed on beaches designated with names like Red, Green, and Blue, facing an enemy determined to defend every meter of ground. Among the chaos of displaced civilians and retreating forces, hundreds of Japanese women found themselves caught between two worlds they had been taught to fear more than anything else: capture by enemy forces and the shame that would follow. For weeks, they had heard the propaganda broadcasts, seen the posters, listened to the warnings from military officials and community leaders. What these women had been told about their captors, particularly about soldiers of African descent, would collide with reality in a way that would shatter propaganda and reveal the profound humanity that exists even in the darkest chapters of human conflict. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how compassion defied hatred, how kindness broke through years of indoctrination, and how a group of soldiers proved that the content of one's character transcends the boundaries drawn by war and prejudice. It is a story about the power of human decency to overcome the most sophisticated propaganda machines, and about the courage required to admit when everything you believed was a lie. In the spring of 1945, the island of Okinawa had become the epicenter of one of the most intense campaigns in the Pacific. The local population, numbering over 300,000 civilians, found themselves trapped in a conflict that was rapidly consuming everything in its path. Among them were women who had served as nurses, teachers, administrative workers, and support staff for the military infrastructure that had been built across the island over years of occupation. These women, many of them barely out of their teenage years, had been subjected to relentless propaganda that painted a terrifying picture of what would happen if they were captured by enemy forces. The propaganda campaign had been systematic and comprehensive. Posters displayed in every public space showed caricatured images designed to provoke fear and revulsion. Radio broadcasts repeated warnings about the fate that awaited those who fell into enemy hands. Teachers in schools, officials in government offices, even religious leaders had echoed these messages, creating a blanket of terror that covered the entire civilian population. For women, the warnings were particularly explicit and horrifying, designed to ensure that they would choose any alternative, including ending their own lives rather than face capture. Sergeant James Bradley of the 577th Quartermaster Battalion stood at the entrance of a makeshift detention facility near the coastal town of Naha in late April. The 32-year-old from Atlanta, Georgia, had seen his share of difficult assignments since arriving in the Pacific Theater 18 months earlier, but nothing had prepared him for what he would encounter in the weeks ahead. Bradley had grown up in the Jim Crow South, experiencing firsthand the cruelty of segregation and the casual brutality of racial prejudice. He had learned early in life what it meant to be judged not by his character or capabilities, but by the color of his skin. These experiences had not made him bitter, but had instead instilled in him a deep commitment to treating others with the dignity he himself had often been denied. Bradley's unit, composed primarily of African-American soldiers, had been tasked with managing supply lines and providing support services, including the processing and care of displaced persons and prisoners. The 577th had been activated in 1943 and had served throughout the Pacific Campaign, handling logistics that were essential to the advance across thousands of kilometers of ocean. The men of the unit were skilled at their jobs, professional in their conduct, and proud of their service despite the discrimination they faced within their own military structure. The American military in 1945 remained strictly segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, often commanded by white officers, and were frequently assigned to service roles rather than combat positions, regardless of their qualifications or desires. This segregation was not a reflection of ability or performance, but a product of the same racial prejudice that shaped American society at home. The men of the 577th understood this reality intimately. They knew that their heroism would often go unrecognized, their contributions minimized, their capabilities questioned simply because of their race. Yet they served with distinction, determined to prove their worth, not because they should have had to prove anything, but because they believed in something larger, than the prejudice that surrounded them. The propaganda machine that had terrified the Japanese civilian population had been relentless in its portrayal of enemy soldiers, but particularly vicious in its depiction of black servicemen. Drawing on existing racist stereotypes and amplifying them into existential horror, the propaganda created images of savagery and brutality that bore no resemblance to reality. Japanese civilians had been told stories designed to invoke primal terror, tales that dehumanized black soldiers to such an extent that capture by them seemed worse than any alternative. For the women who now found themselves under the care of Bradley's unit, the fear was palpable and all-consuming. Every belief they held, every warning they had received, told them they were facing their worst nightmare. On April 23rd, the first group of 14 women arrived at the facility. They had been found hiding in caves along the southern coast, malnourished, dehydrated, and terrified. Local interpreters, Okinawan civilians who had chosen to cooperate with the occupying forces, had managed to coax them out with promises of safety and medical care. The women emerged slowly, eyes wide with fear, bodies trembling with exhaustion and terror. As they were brought to the facility and saw the soldiers who would be responsible for their care, several began to weep uncontrollably. One woman attempted to run despite her weakened condition and had to be gently restrained to prevent her from injuring herself. Private First Class. Robert Washington, a 24-year-old medic from Chicago, watched as the women were brought in. Washington had studied at a technical college before being drafted, hoping to become a doctor someday. His medical training, though limited by the constraints of military service, was solid. He understood the basics of trauma care, infection control, and the treatment of malnutrition and disease. But more importantly, Washington possessed something that no amount of training could provide: a deep well of compassion and an instinctive understanding that healing required more than just treating physical symptoms. Washington observed the women carefully, noting their physical condition and their extreme psychological distress. Their faces were marked by exhaustion and terror. Several were injured, suffering from malnutrition and exposure. Cuts and bruises covered their arms and legs, evidence of their desperate flight through rough terrain. Their clothing was torn and filthy, their hair matted with dirt and sweat. But it was their eyes that struck Washington most forcefully, eyes that held not just fear, but absolute certainty that they were about to experience horrors beyond imagination. One woman, later identified as Kimiko Tanaka, a 26-year-old former teacher from a small village on the island's eastern coast, collapsed upon seeing the soldiers. Her legs simply gave out beneath her, and she fell to the ground, her body shaking with sobs of terror and despair. Kimiko had taught elementary school children before the conflict intensified. She had loved her work, loved the curiosity and enthusiasm of young minds. She had been engaged to be married to a young man who had been conscripted into service 2 years earlier, and from whom she had heard nothing in over a year. When the fighting had reached her village, she and other women had fled into the hills, carrying what little they could, trying to stay ahead of the advancing lines. For Kimiko, the propaganda had been especially effective because it had confirmed existing fears and prejudices she had absorbed from her culture and upbringing. She had been raised in a society that emphasized homogeneity and was deeply suspicious of outsiders. The addition of explicitly racist propaganda about black soldiers had created in her mind an image of captors who were not just enemies, but monsters. She had fully expected that capture would mean violation, torture, and a fate worse than any alternative. Her collapse was not merely physical exhaustion, though she was certainly exhausted. It was the complete surrender of someone who believed they had run out of options, who had finally been caught by the nightmare they had been fleeing. What happened next would begin a transformation that none of them could have anticipated. Washington immediately moved to help, his medical training overriding any other consideration. He approached Kimiko slowly, speaking softly in his limited Japanese. He had learned a few phrases during his time in the Pacific, mostly simple words meant to communicate basic intentions. His pronunciation was terrible, his grammar non-existent, but his tone was unmistakable, gentle, concerned, completely devoid of threat. He knelt beside Kimiko, careful to maintain a respectful distance, and checked her vital signs. Her pulse was rapid and weak, her breathing shallow and labored. She was severely dehydrated, possibly suffering from heat exhaustion, in addition to her obvious state of shock. Washington called for water and medical supplies, his movements calm and professional. He explained what he was doing, even though he doubted she understood his words. He showed her the medical equipment before using it, making every action transparent and predictable. Within minutes, Washington had arranged for Kimiko to receive medical attention, clean water, and a safe place to rest. He coordinated with other medics and support staff, ensuring that each of the 14 women received immediate care appropriate to their condition. His colleague, Corporal Michael Henderson, a trained emergency responder from Boston, worked alongside him, checking for serious injuries, administering intravenous fluids to those most severely dehydrated, and carefully documenting each woman's condition. Corporal David Thompson, a 30-year-old from Philadelphia who had worked as a social worker before the conflict, took charge of coordinating the overall care for the new arrivals. Thompson had 3 sisters back home, and the sight of these terrified women struck a deep chord within him. He had spent his civilian career working with vulnerable populations, families displaced by economic hardship, children removed from dangerous home situations, individuals struggling with trauma and loss. He understood, perhaps better than most, that physical safety was only the first step in helping someone recover from profound fear and trauma. Thompson organized his men to provide blankets, food, and medical supplies, ensuring that every interaction was marked by respect and gentleness. He established protocols for the facility that prioritized the women's dignity and autonomy. Separate sleeping areas were set up with privacy screens. Bathroom facilities, though crude by normal standards, were arranged to provide maximum privacy. Food preparation and distribution were handled with care to accommodate different dietary needs and preferences as much as supplies allowed. The soldiers moved with deliberate calm, speaking in quiet tones, always announcing their presence before entering any area where the women were housed. Thompson drilled this into his men repeatedly. Make no sudden movements, speak softly, give them space and time to adjust. Every soldier understood that these women were not threats. They were traumatized civilians who needed care and protection. Some of the soldiers, particularly those who had families back home, found themselves thinking of their own mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters, imagining what they would want for their loved ones if circumstances were reversed. The first 48 hours were marked by an almost complete silence from the women. They huddled together in groups of 2 or 3, refusing food initially, avoiding eye contact, flinching at any approach no matter how gentle. The interpreters tried to explain that they were safe, that no harm would come to them, that they would receive medical care and eventually be reunited with any surviving family members. But words meant little against the weight of propaganda that had been reinforced for years. The women believed what they had been taught, and their current situation, captured by the very soldiers they had been warned about, seemed to confirm their worst fears. Staff Sergeant William Harris, a 40-year-old from Mississippi who had grown up under the harsh realities of segregation in the Deep South, understood fear on a fundamental level. Harris had experienced countless moments in his life when he had been made to feel afraid simply for existing, afraid of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person, afraid of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, afraid of the violence that could erupt from the simplest misunderstanding or imagined slight. He had learned to navigate a world that saw him as a threat regardless of his actions or intentions, and this experience had given him a particular insight into the psychology of fear and mistrust. Harris instructed his men to be patient, to let the women observe them from a distance, to demonstrate through actions rather than words that they were safe. He understood that trust could not be demanded or rushed. It had to be earned through consistency and genuine care. So the soldiers went about their duties, making sure the women saw them performing mundane tasks, preparing food, organizing supplies, maintaining equipment. They sang while they worked, not loudly or aggressively, but the natural songs that men sang to pass time and maintain spirits. They laughed occasionally, genuine moments of human connection and humor that demonstrated they were people, not monsters. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day. A 5-year-old girl named Yuki, separated from her mother in the chaos of displacement, had been brought to the facility by a local farmer who had found her wandering alone. The child was inconsolable, crying for hours, despite the efforts of female interpreters to comfort her. The women being cared for at the facility watched this distressed child with their own anguish, wanting to help but paralyzed by their own fear and trauma. The little girl represented everything they had lost: innocence, safety, the normal life that had been torn apart by conflict. It was Private First Class Marcus Johnson, a gentle giant of a man from Louisiana, who stood nearly 2 meters tall and weighed well over 100 kilograms, who finally reached Yuki. Johnson had 4 younger siblings back home and a natural way with children. He was the youngest in his unit to hold the rank of Private First Class, having demonstrated exceptional ability in logistics coordination and supply management. But more than his professional skills, Johnson was known for his kind heart and patient temperament. Other soldiers often came to him with their troubles, knowing he would listen without judgment and offer thoughtful counsel. Johnson sat several feet away from Yuki, not approaching, just being present. He understood instinctively that the child needed to not feel threatened or overwhelmed. He began to hum quietly, a lullaby his own mother had sung to him when he was small. The melody was simple and soothing, carrying across the warm evening air. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, the child's crying subsided to hiccuping sobs. Johnson continued to hum, adding quiet words in English that Yuki could not understand, but whose meaning was clear from his tone. Words of comfort and safety, promises that everything would be all right. Slowly, carefully, Johnson pulled out a small wooden toy he had carved during downtime, a simple bird on a string that could be made to dance and bob with the manipulation of the attached strings. Carving was a hobby Johnson had picked up during long stretches of waiting that characterized much of military service. He found the rhythmic work of shaping wood with a small knife to be meditative, a way to calm his mind and create something beautiful out of something ordinary. He had carved dozens of small figures during his time in the Pacific, giving many away to local children he encountered or sending them home to his siblings. Johnson set the bird toy on the ground between himself and Yuki, about halfway, and made it dance. The bird bobbed and spun, its carved wings appearing to flutter with the movement of the strings. Yuki's tear-streaked face watched the bird, her crying stopping as curiosity overcame distress. Johnson made the bird hop closer to her, then back toward himself, never rushing, always giving her the choice to engage or retreat. After several minutes, Yuki reached out tentatively and touched the bird. Johnson let the strings go slack, allowing her to pick it up and examine it. A small smile, the first anyone had seen from the child since her arrival, appeared on her face. The women witnessed this interaction from where they were housed. They saw the patience, the gentleness, the genuine care in Johnson's actions. They watched how he never invaded the child's space, never rushed her, never demanded anything from her. They saw how he offered comfort and distraction through his presence and his gift, asking nothing in return. This simple interaction between a large black soldier and a small Japanese child began to create cracks in the wall of fear that propaganda had built in their minds. Kimiko, the teacher who had collapsed upon first arrival, watched with particular intensity. She had spent years working with young children, understanding their needs and their fears. She recognized in Johnson's actions the same patient care that any good teacher would demonstrate. She saw him not as the monster of propaganda, but as a man who knew how to comfort a frightened child. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything she had been taught said that soldiers like Johnson were incapable of such gentleness, that they were threats to children rather than protectors. But her own eyes, her own experience working with children, told her that what she was witnessing was genuine kindness. It was Kimiko who spoke first to the soldiers, her voice barely above a whisper, asking through an interpreter if the child could have some water and perhaps something to eat. The interpreter, a middle-aged Okinawan woman named Miyako, who had chosen to work with the occupying forces to help bridge the gap between military necessity and civilian welfare, conveyed the request with barely concealed relief. It was the first time any of the women had initiated communication beyond absolute necessity, the first small step toward engagement rather than pure defensive withdrawal. Thompson immediately arranged for water and food suitable for a young child. Yuki was given crackers and a sweet fruit drink, which she consumed quickly, evidence of her hunger. Johnson remained nearby, not hovering but available if needed, continuing to carve another small figure, his hands occupied with familiar, non-threatening work. The women watched all of this, processing what they were seeing against what they had been taught to believe. Over the following days, small gestures began to accumulate, each one chipping away at the edifice of propaganda. Sergeant Bradley ensured that the facility received proper supplies, not just basic necessities, but items that recognized the dignity and humanity of those in their care. Clean clothing appeared, carefully selected from supply stores meant for other purposes. Bradley had to negotiate and call in favors to get these items, but he considered it essential. The women had arrived in torn, filthy garments, and Bradley understood that clean clothes were not just a comfort, but a statement that they were valued and worthy of care. Thompson arranged for privacy screens to be erected around the sleeping areas and bathroom facilities. These screens were made from whatever materials were available: canvas tarps, wooden frames, even cardboard in some places. They were not fancy, but they provided the privacy that the women needed to feel secure. Thompson also established clear schedules for activities like meals and medical checks, providing predictability in an otherwise chaotic and frightening situation. Humans need routine and structure to feel safe, and Thompson worked to provide as much of both as circumstances allowed. The kitchen staff, led by Sergeant First Class Raymond Brown from Detroit, began preparing meals that, while limited by available ingredients, showed thought and care. Brown had worked in his family's restaurant before being drafted, learning from his father and grandfather the art of turning simple ingredients into nourishing, comforting food. He understood that food was more than just fuel. It was comfort, culture and care made tangible. Brown tried to incorporate rice and vegetables in ways that might be more familiar to the women, using cooking techniques that would produce results closer to what they knew rather than standard military mess hall preparations. Brown consulted with the interpreters about dietary preferences and restrictions, learning what he could about Japanese cuisine and trying to adapt with the limited resources available. He made sure that tea was available, recognizing its cultural importance. He took care with the presentation of food, serving it in ways that respected Japanese customs as much as possible in a makeshift facility. When one of the women became ill from something she ate, Brown personally took responsibility, adjusting his preparations to ensure it would not happen again. His genuine concern and willingness to adapt based on feedback did not go unnoticed. The medical care provided was exemplary. Washington and his team treated every injury and illness with the same attention and skill they would give to their own comrades. A young woman named Haruko, 22 years old, and suffering from an infected wound on her leg that she had sustained while fleeing through rough terrain, had been certain she would be left to suffer, or worse. The infection was serious, with visible red streaks indicating it was spreading. Without proper treatment, she could lose her leg or even her life. Washington spent hours carefully cleaning and dressing Haruko's wound, a process that was undoubtedly painful but necessary. He administered precious antibiotics, medications that were always in short supply and carefully rationed. He checked on her progress multiple times each day, monitoring for signs of improvement or deterioration. He changed her dressings with meticulous care, explaining each step through the interpreter, even though he knew she was probably too scared to really process what he was saying. His concern was genuine, his care meticulous, his dedication to her recovery absolute. As the days passed and the antibiotics began to work, the infection started to recede. The red streaks faded, the swelling diminished. The wound began to show signs of healthy healing. Haruko, who had been in constant pain and convinced she would lose her leg if not her life, began to recover. And with her physical recovery came a psychological transformation. She had been cared for with skill and compassion by someone she had been taught to fear and hate. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, leading not to denial but to a gradual acceptance that everything she had been taught was wrong. When Haruko was finally able to walk again without significant pain, she wept, not from physical discomfort, but from the overwhelming confusion and gratitude of receiving such care from someone she had expected to harm her. She struggled to reconcile her lived experience with her taught beliefs, and slowly, painfully, her lived experience won out. She began to see Washington and the other soldiers not as the monsters of propaganda, but as men, human beings capable of kindness and dedicated to healing rather than harm. By early May, more women had arrived at the facility, displaced by the ongoing operations and the gradual stabilization of civilian areas. The facility now housed over 60 women, ranging in age from teenagers to elderly grandmothers. Word had begun to spread among them about the treatment they were receiving. The initial group of 14 women who had been there longest began to share their experiences with the new arrivals, helping to ease their terror and explaining that despite everything they had been told, they were safe here. This peer support was crucial. New arrivals were understandably terrified, arriving with the same propaganda-induced fears that the original group had experienced. But hearing from other Japanese women that they were safe, that they had been treated with respect and care, had far more impact than any reassurance from soldiers or official interpreters could provide. Slowly, the facility began to develop a sense of community. Women who had been isolated in their terror began to form connections with each other, sharing their stories, supporting each other through difficult moments. Staff Sergeant Harris, with his patient demeanor and understanding eyes, became a trusted figure. Through interpreters, women began to share their stories with him, their fears, their experiences during the conflict, their worries about family members they had been separated from. Harris listened, never judging, never minimizing their experiences, simply bearing witness to their humanity. He recognized that many of these women were carrying profound trauma, not just from their recent displacement, but from years of living under constant stress and fear. He could not solve all their problems or erase their trauma, but he could listen, validate their experiences, and ensure they felt heard and valued. One evening in mid-May, as the tropical sun set over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the compound and painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, an extraordinary thing happened. The soldiers, during their limited downtime, often sang together. These songs were gospel spirituals and work songs, spirituals that connected them to their heritage and community. The songs spoke of struggle and perseverance, of hope maintained in the face of hardship, of faith that better days would come. The men's voices, rich and harmonious, carried across the facility, filling the warm evening air with music that transcended language and culture. The women, who had been preparing for sleep, stopped and listened. The music was unlike anything they had heard before, filled with emotion and spiritual depth that spoke to universal human experiences. Even without understanding the words, they could feel the longing and hope embedded in the melodies. They heard in these songs the same things they felt themselves: the desire to return home, the hope for better days, the strength to endure hardship. The music created a moment of shared humanity, a bridge across the divide of language, culture, and conflict. Several of the women began to cry quietly as they listened, not from fear or pain, but from emotional release. The music touched something deep within them, bypassing their conscious thoughts and reaching directly to their hearts. In that moment, they heard not enemy soldiers, but men who felt and longed and hoped just as they did. The power of that music, its honesty and emotional truth, communicated what words never could about the humanity of those who sang it. The next morning, Sachiko, a 34-year-old former nurse who had worked in a hospital before the intensification of the conflict, approached Corporal Thompson. Through the interpreter Miyako, she made an unexpected request. She asked if she could help in the medical facility. She explained that she had training and experience, that she wanted to be useful, to contribute. She said she could not bear to simply sit idle when there was work to be done and people who needed care. Her request was both brave and revealing. Brave because approaching the soldiers still required overcoming residual fear, revealing because it showed a transformation in how she saw herself and her situation. Thompson was momentarily taken aback. Allowing one of the women being cared for to work alongside the soldiers was unprecedented and potentially complicated. There were questions of protocol, security, and safety to consider. But Thompson also recognized the deeper significance of Sachiko's request. She was not asking for special treatment or privileges. She was asking to contribute, to be useful, to have purpose and agency, rather than being simply a passive recipient of care. Thompson understood from his social work background that giving people the ability to contribute and feel useful was crucial for their psychological recovery. After consulting with Sergeant Bradley and Private Washington, they agreed to Sachiko's request with certain conditions and supervision. Sachiko began working alongside the medical team, initially performing basic tasks like organizing supplies and preparing bandages, always under close supervision. But her skill and knowledge quickly became apparent. She knew how to change dressings properly, how to monitor patients for signs of infection or deterioration, how to provide comfort to those in pain. Her hands moved with the confidence and competence of someone well-trained and experienced. Washington found himself learning from Sachiko as they worked together. She showed him techniques for certain types of dressings that she had learned in her training, approaches that were different from American military medical practice, but equally effective. They developed a working relationship based on mutual respect for each other's skills and dedication to patient care. For Sachiko, working in the medical facility restored a sense of purpose and identity that had been stripped away by displacement and trauma. She was not just a victim or a refugee, she was a nurse, a skilled professional contributing to the care of others. Sachiko's presence in the medical facility also helped other women feel more comfortable seeking medical attention. Some had been reluctant to discuss certain health concerns with male soldiers, even with interpreters present. Having Sachiko available provided an option that felt safer and more culturally appropriate. She became a bridge between the women and the medical team, helping to communicate concerns, explaining treatments, and providing reassurance based on her own experience of working with the soldiers. As the days turned into weeks, the transformation continued in countless small ways. Johnson taught Yuki and several other children who had arrived at the facility simple games, drawing figures in the dirt, playing catch with a ball made from rolled-up cloth, creating little toys from scraps of wood and string. The children's laughter, once absent, began to fill the compound. For the women watching their children play safely, cared for and protected rather than threatened, the contrast with the propaganda they had been fed became impossible to ignore. Brown, in the kitchen, began incorporating suggestions from some of the women into meal preparations. They taught him how to properly prepare rice the way they were accustomed to, how to season vegetables to bring out their flavors in familiar ways, small techniques that made the food taste more like home. Brown was eager to learn, recognizing that good food was one of the few comforts available in their current circumstances. This collaboration in the kitchen became another form of connection, creating small moments of normalcy and shared purpose. Harris organized a system where the women could send messages to family members in other areas of Okinawa. Working through proper military channels and civilian authorities, he helped coordinate efforts to reunite separated families when possible. For women who had been torn away from husbands, children, parents, or siblings, the ability to send word that they were alive and safe was invaluable. Harris spent hours coordinating these efforts, working through bureaucratic obstacles and communication challenges, driven by his understanding of how important family connection was for recovery and hope. But perhaps the most powerful moment in this entire experience came in mid-May, nearly a month after the first women had arrived at the facility. Kimiko, the teacher who had collapsed upon first arrival, who had been certain she was facing her worst nightmare, asked to speak with Sergeant Bradley privately. Through the interpreter Miyako, whom both parties had come to trust deeply, she shared something that would stay with Bradley for the rest of his life and would profoundly impact Kimiko's own future path. Kimiko described in detail the propaganda they had been exposed to for years. She explained how it had started subtly, with jokes and stereotypes in newspapers and radio programs, then gradually escalated to explicit warnings and terrifying depictions. She described posters that had been displayed in public spaces, showing caricatured images, designed to invoke visceral horror. She recounted radio broadcasts that had repeated warnings about the fate that awaited those who fell into enemy hands, broadcasts that were particularly explicit and horrifying in their depictions of black soldiers. She explained how military officials and government representatives had given speeches reinforcing these messages, how teachers in schools had been instructed to warn children, how even religious leaders had echoed these warnings from their positions of spiritual authority. She described how this propaganda had been inescapable, creating a blanket of terror that covered the entire society. By the time the conflict reached Okinawa directly, the fear had been so deeply ingrained that many civilians chose to hide in caves, to flee into dangerous terrain, or even to end their own lives rather than face capture. Kimiko told Bradley that she herself had considered ending her life rather than face what she believed awaited her in captivity. She described standing at the edge of a cliff during her flight through the hills, looking down at the rocks and waves below, seriously contemplating whether jumping would be preferable to capture. She had been stopped only by physical exhaustion and the intervention of another woman who had pulled her back and urged her to keep moving. She had been captured not because she surrendered, but because she simply could not run any further, her body giving out from hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. And then she described her first days at the facility, the absolute terror she had felt, the certainty that all her worst fears were about to be realized. She recounted collapsing when she saw the soldiers, remembered the strange sensation of lying on the ground and feeling hands touch her, expecting pain or violation, but experiencing instead gentle medical assessment and care. She talked about the confusion of receiving clean water, medical treatment, a safe place to rest. She described watching the soldiers interact with little Yuki, seeing genuine kindness and patience, rather than the cruelty she had expected. Kimiko spoke for nearly an hour, Miyako translating her words carefully and completely, allowing Bradley to understand the full depth and impact of what she was sharing. And then, Kimiko did something that broke through every barrier, every wall, every vestige of the indoctrination she had endured. She wept, not from fear or physical pain as she had done so many times in recent weeks, but from shame and gratitude intertwined in a way that was almost unbearable in its intensity. She told Bradley that she had been taught lies, deliberate and systematic lies designed to dehumanize him and his men and make them seem like monsters. She said that everything she had believed about him and his men had been deliberately constructed to make her afraid, to control her behavior, to ensure she would resist capture at any cost. She explained that the kindness, dignity, and respect they had shown her, and the other women had shattered those lies completely, not through arguments or persuasion, but through simple, consistent demonstration of human decency. Kimiko apologized, though she had nothing to apologize for, as she had been a victim of propaganda rather than its perpetrator. She thanked Bradley for treating her and the other women not as enemies, not as prisoners, not even as refugees or displaced persons, but as human beings deserving of care and compassion. She said that what he and his men had done was save her life twice, once physically by providing medical care and safety, and once spiritually by helping her escape the prison of fear and hatred that propaganda had built in her mind. Bradley, a man who had faced discrimination and prejudice his entire life in his own country, who had served honorably despite being relegated to service units rather than combat roles based solely on the color of his skin, who had been told countless times through words and actions that he was inferior or dangerous simply because of his race, felt the weight of that moment profoundly. Here was someone who had been taught to see him as a monster, taught by a massive propaganda apparatus supported by government, media, and cultural institutions, now recognizing the humanity that others in his own nation sometimes refused to acknowledge. Bradley had grown up in Atlanta during a time when lynchings were still common, when black men could be targeted for violence based on the flimsiest accusations or no accusations at all, when simply being in the wrong place or saying the wrong thing could mean injury or loss of life. He had experienced the casual everyday cruelty of segregation, the separate and decidedly unequal facilities, the jobs he could not hold, the places he could not go, the basic human dignity that was routinely denied to him and people who looked like him. He had joined the military hoping to serve his country, to prove his worth, only to find that even in uniform, he was still relegated to second-class status, still viewed with suspicion and prejudice. And now, here in this makeshift facility on a tropical island thousands of kilometers from home, a woman who had been systematically taught to fear and hate him was thanking him for his humanity, was recognizing in him qualities that his own society often refused to see. The irony was almost overwhelming. Bradley felt emotions he could barely name, validation mixed with sadness, gratitude mixed with anger at all the injustice that made this moment so significant. Bradley told Kimiko, through Miyako's careful translation, that she and the other women were safe, that they would continue to receive the best care his unit could provide, and that they would be treated with the dignity that every person deserves. He told her that he understood how propaganda worked, how fear could be manufactured and manipulated, how lies could be made to seem like truth when repeated often enough by trusted authorities. He said that he harbored no anger toward her or the other women for their initial fear, that he understood it was not personal, but rather the result of systematic indoctrination. He also shared briefly something of his own experience. He told her that in his own country, in the place he called home, there was also propaganda about people like him. Lies and stereotypes designed to make others fear or despise him. He explained that he knew what it felt like to be prejudged, to be seen as a threat or a problem rather than as an individual human being. He said that his experience of being dehumanized had taught him how important it was to recognize the humanity in others, to refuse to perpetuate the cycle of hatred and fear, to treat others the way he wished to be treated himself. This exchange between Bradley and Kimiko, conducted through translation and marked by deep emotion on both sides, represented something more than just a personal moment between two individuals. It represented a triumph of human connection over propaganda, of direct experience over taught hatred, of compassion over prejudice. It showed that even the most sophisticated and pervasive propaganda could be overcome when people had the opportunity to interact with each other as human beings, rather than as caricatures or categories. The story of Bradley's unit and the women in their care eventually reached higher command levels through routine reports and inspections. Major Thomas Richardson, an African-American officer who served as a liaison to upper command structures and who had fought tirelessly for recognition of black soldiers' contributions throughout the conflict, visited the facility in late May. Richardson, a graduate of Howard University and one of the relatively few black officers in the military at that time, had dedicated much of his career to documenting and advocating for the recognition that African-American service members deserved. Richardson spent 2 days at the facility, observing operations, speaking with soldiers and with the women through interpreters, reviewing medical records and supply manifests. What he witnessed moved him deeply. He saw not just competent management of a difficult assignment, but exemplary care marked by genuine compassion and respect. He saw soldiers who could have been indifferent or even resentful of their assignment, instead treating it as an opportunity to demonstrate the best of what they represented. He saw women who had arrived in terror now participating in the community, contributing their skills, beginning to heal from trauma. Richardson documented everything in detailed reports that he submitted through proper channels. He emphasized the professionalism and humanitarian conduct of Bradley's unit, noting specific examples of care that went beyond basic requirements. He made sure that the contributions of individual soldiers like Washington, Thompson, Harris, Johnson, and Brown were recorded and recognized. He also noted the cooperation and contributions of the women themselves, particularly Sachiko's work in the medical facility, arguing that their willingness to participate and contribute was evidence of successful management and care. Richardson's reports contributed to a broader recognition of the professionalism and humanity demonstrated by African-American service members throughout the Pacific Theater, though it would take many more years and continued advocacy before that recognition would be properly reflected in historical accounts and official honors. The experiences at the facility on Okinawa became part of the record that documented black soldiers' contributions to not just military victory, but to humanitarian efforts and the complex work of occupation and reconstruction. As June arrived and the situation on Okinawa began to stabilize, arrangements were made to transfer the women to larger civilian processing centers, where they could eventually be reunited with surviving family members or begin the process of rebuilding their lives. These centers were being established to handle the massive displacement of civilians caused by the conflict, providing temporary housing, medical care, and assistance in locating family members and determining next steps. The day of departure was emotional for everyone involved. Women who had arrived in absolute terror weeks earlier, who had believed they were facing their worst nightmares, now departed with profound gratitude and a completely transformed understanding of the world and themselves. There were tears, but not tears of fear or pain, tears of gratitude, sadness at parting, and hope for the future mixed with uncertainty about what that future would hold. Haruko, whose infected wound had healed thanks to Washington's dedicated care, approached him on the morning of departure. Through Miyako, she thanked him for saving her leg and possibly her life. Then she presented him with a small origami crane she had carefully folded from a piece of paper. She explained, with Miyako translating, that in her culture the crane represented hope and healing, that it was a symbol of good fortune and peace. She said that Washington had given her both hope and healing, and she wanted him to have something that represented what he had done for her. Washington accepted the crane with deep emotion. This small piece of folded paper, created with care from one of the few materials available to her, represented far more than its physical form suggested. It represented transformation, the journey from fear to trust, from propaganda-induced hatred to genuine gratitude and respect. Washington kept that crane in his wallet for the rest of his life, a physical reminder of the connections that can form even in the most unlikely circumstances, proof that human decency and compassion can bridge any divide. Sachiko, the nurse who had joined the medical team and worked alongside Washington and the others, embraced Corporal Thompson in a gesture that transcended cultural norms about physical contact with strangers. She thanked him for allowing her to maintain her dignity through purpose and work. She told him that his trust in her had helped her trust herself again, to see beyond the propaganda and recognize that healing and care transcend any division of nationality or allegiance. She said that working in the medical facility had reminded her who she was, not just a victim or refugee, but a skilled nurse with value and purpose. Thompson told her that she had been an invaluable part of the team, that her skill and dedication had improved the care they could provide, and that her presence had helped other women feel more comfortable seeking medical attention. He encouraged her to continue her nursing career once she was settled, saying that the world needed more people like her, who dedicated themselves to healing and care. Sachiko promised she would, carrying with her not just her medical skills, but the lesson that compassion could bridge any divide. Yuki, the little girl who had been consoled by Johnson weeks earlier, had grown deeply attached to the kind soldier who had made her wooden toys and taught her to play games. As she prepared to leave with a reunited aunt who had been located through Harris's patient efforts to connect separated families, she approached Johnson shyly. She had drawn a picture on a piece of paper, a crude but heartfelt depiction of a tall soldier and a small child, holding hands under a bright sun with flowers scattered around them. She presented this drawing to Johnson, saying a few words in Japanese that Miyako translated, "Thank you for being kind to me when I was scared." Johnson knelt down to accept the drawing, his eyes filling with tears, despite his best efforts to maintain composure. He carefully folded that drawing and would later send it home to his own family, along with a letter describing his experience on Okinawa. He wrote to his mother about finding hope in the most unexpected place, about how even in the midst of conflict and suffering, there were moments of pure human connection that reminded him why kindness mattered. His mother would keep that letter and that drawing in a special box, and after Johnson's passing many years later, his children would find it and come to understand something profound about their father. Other women lined up to say goodbye to the soldiers who had cared for them. Some presented small gifts, origami figures, drawings, messages written in Japanese that had to be translated. Each gift represented a transformation, a journey from propaganda-induced terror to genuine gratitude and respect. The soldiers accepted these gifts with deep appreciation, understanding their significance. These were not just tokens of thanks, but evidence that human connection could overcome the most sophisticated propaganda, that direct experience could shatter lies, that compassion was more powerful than hatred. Brown, the cook who had worked to make meals more familiar and comforting, received thanks from multiple women who explained through interpreters how much it had meant to have food that tasted like home. to see that someone cared enough to try to understand their preferences and accommodate them. Brown, who had sometimes felt that his work in the kitchen was less important than the medical care or security operations, realized that comfort and care could take many forms. That meeting basic needs with thought and attention was itself a form of respect and recognition of humanity. Harris, who had patiently listened to so many stories and coordinated efforts to reconnect separated families, was thanked by women who told him that being heard and having their concerns taken seriously had been as important as any physical care they received. One elderly woman, our grandmother who had been separated from her grandchildren, told Harris through translation that he had restored her faith in human kindness after years of propaganda had tried to teach her that enemies could only be cruel. She said she would tell her grandchildren, if she ever saw them again, that kindness existed in unexpected places and unexpected people. As the trucks that would transport the women to the civilian processing centers prepared to depart, there was a final moment of connection. The soldiers lined up along the route, not formally at attention, but standing together, a final gesture of respect and farewell. As the trucks began to move, the women waved, some calling out words of thanks in Japanese, others simply watching the men who had cared for them. The soldiers waved back, their own emotions visible on their faces. This was not a military operation concluding or a mission accomplished. This was human beings who had formed genuine connections parting ways, uncertain if they would ever see each other again, but certain that they had been changed by the experience. The soldiers of the 577th Quartermaster Battalion continued their service in the Pacific, eventually participating in occupation duties after the conflict ended. Their exemplary conduct on Okinawa became part of their unit record, documented in Richardson's reports and mentioned in efficiency evaluations. But like so many contributions of African American service members, it would take decades for the full story to be properly recognized and honored in broader historical narratives. The immediate post-conflict period was more concerned with demobilization and rebuilding than with ensuring equitable recognition of all who had served. Sergeant James Bradley returned to Atlanta after being discharged in 1946. He arrived home to find that despite his honorable service, despite the recognition his unit had received, despite everything he and his men had accomplished, he still faced the same segregation and discrimination he had left behind. He could not eat at certain restaurants, could not stay at certain hotels, had to sit in the back of buses and trains, faced barriers to employment and housing that had nothing to do with his qualifications and everything to do with the color of his skin. But Bradley carried with him the knowledge that he and his men had represented something greater than any prejudice or propaganda could diminish. He knew that in their treatment of those women on Okinawa, in their steadfast commitment to dignity and humanity, they had proven something that should never have needed proving, that character, honor, and compassion are not determined by the color of one's skin or the circumstances of one's birth. This knowledge sustained him through difficult years, providing a foundation of certainty about his own worth and the worth of his community regardless of what broader society claimed. Bradley became involved in civil rights organizing in Atlanta, working with local churches and community organizations to challenge segregation and demand equal rights. He often told the story of Okinawa, using it to illustrate how propaganda worked to dehumanize people, and how direct human contact could overcome even the most sophisticated lies. He argued that if Japanese civilians could overcome years of propaganda through weeks of human interaction, then American prejudices based on centuries of racism could also be overcome through sustained effort and the insistence on being seen as fully human. Private First Class Robert Washington returned to Chicago, and using benefits provided for veterans, completed his education and went on to medical school. The path was not easy. Black students still faced discrimination in many medical schools, and financial struggles were constant despite the support programs available. But Washington persisted, driven by his experience in the Pacific and his deep desire to heal and help others. He became a physician who dedicated his career to serving underserved communities, establishing a practice in a predominantly black neighborhood where quality medical care was scarce. Washington often thought of Haruko and the other women he had treated on Okinawa. Their experience taught him important lessons about the relationship between healer and patient, about how treating the whole person, rather than just their physical symptoms, was essential for true healing, about how dignity and respect were themselves therapeutic. He kept the origami crane Haruko had given him in his wallet throughout his life, a reminder of why he had chosen medicine and what it meant to truly care for another human being. When he eventually retired after decades of practice, that crane, now faded and worn from years of being carried, was framed and hung in his home, a symbol of a moment that had defined his approach to his life's work. Corporal David Thompson returned to Philadelphia and his work in social services. He brought with him a deeper understanding of trauma, resilience, and the power of patience and compassion that had been reinforced by his experience on Okinawa. Thompson had worked with vulnerable populations before the conflict, but his time in the Pacific had shown him new dimensions of trauma and new possibilities for recovery. He established programs specifically designed to help veterans adjust to civilian life, drawing on lessons learned about the importance of dignity, purpose, and community support in the healing process. Thompson's approach was groundbreaking for its time, emphasizing the psychological and social dimensions of recovery rather than just practical assistance with jobs or housing. He argued that veterans needed to feel valued and useful, needed to have purpose and connection, needed to be heard and understood. His programs included peer support groups, job training that emphasized skills and capabilities rather than deficits, and family counseling that recognized how trauma affected entire households. His work became a model copied by other cities, though his own role in developing these approaches was not always credited in the broader literature. Staff Sergeant William Harris returned to Mississippi, where he faced some of the harshest segregation and most violent racism in the nation. The Mississippi of the late 1940s and early 1950s was a dangerous place for black people, particularly those who spoke out against injustice or demanded their rights. But Harris, fortified by his experience in the Pacific and his knowledge of his own worth, became an educator and civil rights advocate despite the risks. He taught at a black school where resources were scarce and facilities inadequate, but where dedicated teachers worked to provide their students with the best education possible under impossible circumstances. Harris often told his students the story of Okinawa, using it to teach about the power and danger of propaganda, the importance of critical thinking, and the truth that people are far more complex and capable of growth than stereotypes suggest. He encouraged his students to question what they were told, to look for evidence rather than accepting claims at face value, to recognize their own humanity, and insist that others recognize it as well. He also used the story to illustrate that their worth was not determined by how others saw them, that they could maintain their dignity and character regardless of the prejudice they faced. Harris participated in voter registration drives, helped organize economic boycotts of businesses that discriminated, and supported students who participated in sit-ins and freedom rides in the 1960s. His home was sometimes targeted by those opposed to civil rights, windows broken, threatening messages left. But Harris persisted, sustained by his belief that justice would eventually prevail, and by his memory of women on Okinawa who had found the courage to overcome years of indoctrination when faced with truth. Private First Class Marcus Johnson returned to Louisiana and his large family, bringing with him the wooden bird toys he continued to carve during quiet moments, and the memory of a little girl's smile breaking through fear. Johnson settled into civilian life more easily than some veterans, reconnecting with his community and finding work in a local school as a janitor, and later as an assistant in the administration office. Though his formal title was modest, Johnson became an important presence in the school, known for his kindness to students, his willingness to listen to their concerns, and his gentle guidance. Johnson continued to carve small wooden toys, giving them to students who were struggling, to children in his neighborhood, to anyone who seemed to need a small gesture of care. Each toy was unique, crafted with attention and care during quiet evenings, representing Johnson's belief that small acts of kindness mattered. He became known in his community as someone who could be counted on, someone who showed up when needed, someone who embodied the values of patience and care that he had demonstrated on Okinawa. When the civil rights movement heated up in the South, Johnson supported it in quiet ways, opening his home for meetings, providing transportation when needed, offering encouragement to younger activists who were taking more visible risks. He never sought recognition or leadership positions, content to contribute in his own way to the larger struggle for justice. His life illustrated that heroism and significance are not always loud or public, that consistent kindness and reliability are themselves forms of strength and courage. Sergeant First Class Raymond Brown returned to Detroit and his family's restaurant, which had survived the difficult years of the conflict. Brown brought with him new techniques and recipes inspired by his time in the Pacific, expanding the menu to include dishes that reflected his broader experience of the world. The restaurant became a gathering place for veterans, a spot where men who had served could find familiar faces and understanding ears, where war stories could be shared without judgment, where the transition to civilian life could be eased by community and connection. Brown also used the restaurant as a platform for supporting civil rights efforts in Detroit. He provided free meals to activists working on voter registration and desegregation campaigns. He hosted fundraisers for legal defense funds. He used his position as a respected business owner to speak out against discrimination and advocate for change. The restaurant survived urban renewal and economic difficulties, remaining a fixture in its neighborhood for decades, a testament to Brown's skill, determination, and commitment to his community. Brown often reflected on his experience feeding the women on Okinawa, on how food prepared with care and thought could be an act of compassion and connection that transcended any barrier. He believed that sharing food was one of the most fundamental human connections. Breaking bread together was a statement of peace and mutual humanity. This philosophy shaped how he ran his restaurant, as a place where everyone was welcome, where good food was prepared with care, where community was built one meal at a time. The women scattered across Okinawa and eventually throughout Japan as reconstruction progressed, and people worked to rebuild their lives from the devastation of conflict. Some, like Kimiko, actively worked to counter the propaganda and prejudice they had been taught. Kimiko became an educator herself, dedicating her career to teaching about the dangers of propaganda and the importance of critical thinking. She developed curriculum materials about media literacy and psychological manipulation, teaching students to recognize when they were being manipulated and to question authority claims that were not backed by evidence. Kimiko often spoke publicly about her experience on Okinawa when circumstances allowed and when her story would be heard. In the immediate post-conflict years, this was difficult, as society was dealing with trauma and reconstruction and was not always ready to hear complex narratives about humanity in the midst of conflict. But as years passed and Japan began to reckon more honestly with its wartime history, Kimiko's story found more receptive audiences. She participated in educational programs, spoke at schools and universities, and contributed to oral history projects that sought to document civilian experiences during the conflict. Kimiko never married. The fiancé she had been waiting for never returned, and was eventually confirmed to have perished during the conflict. But she built a fulfilling life nonetheless, dedicated to education and to the belief that truth and human connection were powerful forces for good in the world. She maintained correspondence with James Bradley for many years, letters exchanged across vast distance that sustained a connection forged in extraordinary circumstances. Their reunion in the 1960s, when Kimiko traveled to the United States as part of an educational delegation, was chronicled in local newspapers as a human interest story, though few who read those accounts understood the full depth and significance of what they were witnessing. Haruko, whose life had been saved by Washington's medical care, returned to nursing once she had recovered fully and circumstances permitted. She worked in hospitals and clinics, providing care to others with the same dedication that had been shown to her. She married and had children, to whom she told the story of her experience on Okinawa, teaching them that people are more complex than the categories we create, that humanity can be found in unexpected places, that gratitude and respect should be given to those who show us kindness, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Haruko kept the memory of Washington's care close to her heart, often thinking of him when she faced difficult cases or challenging patients. She reminded herself that patience and genuine care could make a difference, that taking the extra time to explain procedures and show concern was not just good practice, but a form of respect for human dignity. Her children grew up understanding that their mother had learned important lessons about humanity from someone who could easily have been indifferent or unkind, but chose compassion instead. Sachiko continued her nursing career with renewed dedication, her experience working alongside the American medical team having reinforced her sense of purpose and capability. She worked in various hospitals and medical facilities as Japan rebuilt, eventually specializing in trauma care and emergency medicine. She taught younger nurses not just technical skills, but the importance of seeing patients as whole human beings, of recognizing that healing required more than just treating physical symptoms, of understanding that dignity and respect were themselves therapeutic. Sachiko sometimes reflected on the irony that she had learned some of her most important lessons about Nu